Thank you for inviting me to this conference. My presentation will be very much different from most of the previous ones because there will be no city-states in my presentation. There will be few data, no graphs. So that's very much different what we've seen before, but hopefully it will be useful anyway. So what will I be trying to do? The main point that I want to make is that if you look at my presentation is about climate change, but my main point is that if you're looking at complex pre-industrial societies, the impact of climate change is always determined in interaction with and by societal factors, never by climate change in itself. Now, resilience, one of the core concepts of this conference, resilience is a good concept, resilience theory as well, but I would avoid approaches to resilience in the sense of that you have an environmental force like climate change that then sets in motion societal processes, process in a further stagnant society. So I would argue that environmental forces are one of factors, of many factors, internal and external factors that mean that societies are always changing. So it's one of the factors. And that if you want to look at what the response is, that you have to take into account all the other societal changes that are going on at the same time. Now, another thing that I want to address, and that's part of my title, is that we should not have this Malthusian carrying capacity perspective approach to the impact of climate change. And that has been the approach that you see very often. And I have one quote, but there are many publications. You can, if you look, you can always find the same kind of basic argument. I've taken Paulo Malanima, who is actually quite important economic historian, but an economic historian of the early modern period. And he says, well, I have to learn my paper, a quote, the warm so-called medieval climate optimum coincided, again, with population increase across the whole world quite a period, 1270-1840, referred to as the Little Ice Age, was at least in the first part until about 1700 a period of economic hardship and population stability. So he emphasizes climate eras as determining the success of societies. Trends, climate eras, colder, warmer, being equal to times of decline or times of prosperity. And that's also basically what we see in Kyle Harper's book about the fate of Rome. It's the idea that it's the end of the warm period, starting of colder climate, that brings an end to prosperity. Now, so there's an important Malthusian element in all these theories. Malthus saying it's resources or carrying capacity is a limitation of population. So if there's an increase in population, that increases the pressure on resources, and there will be a societal response at limiting the population. Now, climate change can actually be seen as, and it is used in this sense, as an additional element to a Malthusian model approach, where the ceiling of resources, maximum carrying capacity in other words, changes not only due to societal changes, but also due to climate change. So in a beneficial climate change period, the ceiling is raised, creating boom, prosperity, and in an adverse climate change period with a downward trend, the ceiling goes down, creating additional stress, hunger, starvation, famines, more death. Now, So you can integrate, as it has been done, climate change in this Malthusian model. But the Malthusian model has been criticized of alternatives, and one of the alternatives is the famous model by Esther Boserup, who in the 1960s devised her model, and she turns the causality around. She says not in the Malthusian sense that it is resources determining population, but she says it's actually population determining resources. If there's an increase in population, that will create the pressure to change your agricultural system, driving up resources. So basically what she says is, carrying capacity approach is wrong, because carrying capacity as a physical ceiling did not exist. It's always societal factors that determine where this ceiling is. And that means that this ceiling is actually able to be risen by adapting agricultural systems. Now, here again, you can integrate climate change into the model, because it's not only population rise, but adverse climatic conditions to agriculture would then lower the ceiling, triggering a response in society to raise the ceiling again. So it's not a determinant, it's something that can be changed. Societies are not passive. Now, we have been talking about climate eras before, and so I can be brief on this. We talked about this yesterday. When in the mid-20th century, people's attention to climate change is older than that, but in the mid-20th century, there was more attention, better evidence, and they came up with climate change in terms of climate eras, where you had the Roman warm period, the medieval warm period, the Little Ice Age, but with the very low resolution data that they had at that time, it appeared to be uniform long-term climate eras. Now, with the improvement of the proxy data, the methodologies, simply a lot more studies, but also refinement in the models, it's clear that climate change did not occur in these centuries-long uniform eras. So I referred to this yesterday in the discussion, a study by Ilana Soblaki in in a recent volume, and she says if you look at the Eastern Mediterranean, precipitation in the Eastern Mediterranean, you can actually see that there's no common trend throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, no trends occurring in the same direction at the same time. And that was also the conclusion of Helden et al. 2018, a bit before, where they say you actually have several climate regions defined by the direction and the timing of trends. Now, I will be talking about the Little Ice Age, so I want societies in the Little Ice Age, not the late antique one, but the first one called Little Ice Age. And our data are actually much better, because we do not only have the natural proxies, but we also have the historical documents that can say a lot about climate change. And there we have actually the same picture. So not uniform climate eras, centuries long, and this is an illustration of that, and this is actually Europe. I might be not able to read that, but this is Europe. This is actually also not taking into account the big difference that there are within Europe, because also in the second millennium AD, climate did not change at the same time in all parts of Europe. And then you see that the variation at the multi-decadal scale is actually much higher. You cannot really say that you have a clear uniform centuries-long climate eras. But on the other hand, you can see that there are differences. There's a lot more cold, a lot more blue here. There's a lot more dark red and yellow here. So yes, so we should not really throw away the concepts of the Roman warm period or the Little Ice Age, but we have to take into account that these included much more temporal variability, not 3 centuries of cold conditions. Also have to take into account the much larger spatial variability, so that's not really visible in this. And we have to take into account that climate changed actually in much shorter frequencies. So climate changed at a multi-decadal scale. It did not change at multi-centennial scale. Now, we also have to take into account the difference between weather and climate. What I notice is that a lot of literature studies wanting to indicate, wanting to prove the impact, the societal impact of climate change actually are referring to weather events. And it's clear, extreme weather events will have an impact on societies. So that can actually cause harvest failures, and has been mentioned before, if that happens a few years in a row, then that will have a significant impact. You can certainly see that also at a decadal scale. If you look at the 1690s were about one of the coldest decades of the second millennium AD. That caused a great famine in Scotland, caused a great famine in Finland, the greatest famine-induced mortality crisis in Scotland and Finland in the past centuries. But that's also at a relatively short scale, a short period. So what we're actually interested in is what is the impact of climate change at this multi-decadal scale? Was Melanima and the people who have that kind of argument, are they right that at a multi-decadal scale, this cold spells, and there are several cold spells. The 17th century had various cold spells. So maybe not Little Ice Age as a uniform era, but clearly there are more cold spells than in other centuries. So what is the impact of climate change at a multi-decadal scale? Not at the annual scale, not at the scale of weather events. I want to go to the early modern period, continue with the Little Ice Age. Why? Because we have much better data than we will ever have for the ancient world on societal factors. It is not that we can project, it's not that, this happened in the Netherlands or in Britain, so now we know what happened in the Roman period. But I think that can be useful to enlighten our approach, to make us think about what happened. Yeah. For brevity's sake, I will only discuss, maybe you think that's even too much, but 4 modern countries, Netherlands and Britain. I try to be as brief as I can. And the idea is we're looking at climate at changes at a multi-decadal scale. So now in the Netherlands, before the Black Death, high Middle Ages, high productive agriculture with labor-intensive forms of agriculture, flexible crop rotations, manuring, that kind of thing. Post Black Death, or after the onset of the Black Death in the mid-14th century, we see obviously a big decline in agricultural productivity. That has been related to the start of the Little Ice Age. Some people have that start in the 13th century, or 16th, but more obvious is the explanation that the lowering productivity and the shift from labor-intensive to less labor-intensive forms of agriculture had to do with a smaller population. You did not have to make that much of an effort to produce what you need. In the 16th century and later, you see population growing that continued, population continued to grow. You see continued high productivity. You see rising, for a long time, rising living standards in the Netherlands. Is there any impact of climate change at a multi-decadal scale visible in the Netherlands? No. There are no declines in the 17th century despite these colder spells. If you look at Britain, you see the same picture. Lowering agricultural productivity in response to the Black Death, significant lowering of the population, but after that you see agricultural output increasing, population increasing. In most of the centuries, you see agricultural output actually outpacing population, living standards are rising. Now, you cannot really say that climate change did not have any impact. Maybe if the climate, if there would not have been a few cold spells, Britain may actually have done even better. But on the other hand, you do not see what Malanima says. You do not see that there's any decline. So society, I would say, was able to withstand the climatic shocks that were there. In the longer run, at a multi-decadal scale, you do not see much of an impact. But then you can say, this is Netherlands, that is Britain, these are the most productive, these are the most successful economies of the early modern period. So let's go to a few other places. Finland, to begin with. Now, Finland, it's not one of these booming countries in the early modern period. It's a very isolated part, and so isolated that the Black Death never made it to Finland. So there was no impact on population there. We have good triggering evidence for climate change in Finland. That's local records. And then you see there are cooling periods in the 12th century, the 15th century, around 1700, the 1690s, I've mentioned this famine. But this famine did only have a short-term impact on societies. Famines never have very long impacts. It's pandemics that have long-term impacts on demography, not famines. Now, what we can see is in the archaeological evidence and somewhat later in the historical evidence that we have rising populations. From the Middle Ages onwards, you have rising populations, again at a multi-decadal scale. So the famine did cause a dip, but then it rose again. What we do see is a response. It's difficult for us to say to what is that a response to population growth and increasing pressure? Is that a response to climate change, increasing pressure in another way? But what you see is in the long term, intensification of agriculture, but mostly an increase of acreage. Well, no shortage of land in early modern Finland. So if your productivity goes down, you simply, in an extensive way, farm much more land. There's plenty of land to go around. They actually did use slash and burn up to very far in the early modern period. So that's an extensive form of agriculture. Don't need much labor investment in that. And in the 18th century, where we have the evidence, we can actually see that there's a shift towards rye. That's barley, more rye, and that's more cold resistant. So there is a response, and in the long term, and you would say if there's one region in Europe that is vulnerable to a cooling trend, that's on the margins of the temperature, how do you say that, requirement of cereal production. You're right at the margins of where you can actually cultivate cereals in Finland. But still, apart from the short-term effects, you do not see long-term effects. Now Spain, and I try to be as short as possible about Spain, but Spain is very interesting. Spain is very complex, and what's interesting about Spain is that it's actually a shortage of labor that's more a defining element of the economy of Spain than a shortage of land. After the Reconquista, most of Spain had very low population density. So they specialized in labor, extensive forms of agriculture, a lot of grazing, but they also make money out of that because you can make wooden textiles, and they did profit from that. So actually high GDP and high per capita income. Black Death did affect Spain, but much less than in most of the rest of Europe. Only 11% in the first 70, 80 years after Black Death, only a lowering of 17%. Now, in Britain and the Netherlands, the Black Death raised living standards because it reduced pressure. You can leave out marginal lands. But that had never been a problem. So the Black Death, lowering the population somewhat, actually lowered productivity. GDP went down, living standards went down as a result of even more shortage of labor. But then in the 16th and 17th century, we have rising populations, we have rising per capita production. And we also have, how did they sustain the rising population? Largely by expanding the arable, plowing, grazing lands, and then starting to use, to grow cereals on that. Now in the 18th century, you see continued populations of growth. But so also here we see continued population growth. And in the 18th century, it's actually lowering living standards in Spain. And that had to do with the fact that the increase that was possible came to an end. And that had also to do with the fact that unlike most of northwestern, Western Europe, there was no innovation in agriculture. That's only expansion of agriculture, no innovation there. So they reached a limit. Why was there no innovation? Probably due to societal factors, large land ownership, absentee land ownership. So these people, they were not really interested in improving and changing. Now, this is a very short overview of some European countries, and so hopefully we can draw some conclusions from that. I'm actually lost where I am in my story. So if we started with the idea, what is the effect of a multi-decadal cold spells, and we do not see actually in these countries any impact. In Spain it has been claimed that, there again you can argue, but if climate, if you did not have these cold spells, would it not have been better in Spain? Now cold would not be really a problem for most of Spain, but it has been blamed that, that there was a period of increased precipitation that caused a lowering of productivity in agriculture. But that would be very strange, because, well, shortage of precipitation would be for most of Spain the problem. So an increase in precipitation, the highest productivity is in the north of Spain, where you have the highest precipitation levels. So you do not see that much of an evidence of climate change impacting. What you see is various responses, innovation and intensification in those parts of Europe where land is scarcer than labor, and where it's the other way around, where land is more abundant than labor, you find that a good response, a common response, is expansion of acreage. If we then see does this show Malthusian scenarios or Bossaroopian scenarios? I would say Europe in the early modern period shows Bossaroopian responses. And then we cannot really figure out what the impact of climate change is, but you can see that societies were responding, driving up production. So until the 18th century, avoiding lowering living standards. What can we learn from that? Because you're interested in antiquity probably more than in the early modern period. So can we actually apply this? Now, first of all, I think there's a tendency to look at climate change from a negative point of view. That probably has to do that we're looking at it from, that's the interest is partly triggered by the global warming, and global warming has a negative approach to climate change. But should we see climate change actually from a negative, largely from a negative perspective? I would say that because of the ability of human societies to adapt to conditions, it might actually be the case that human societies benefited more from beneficial climate change than that they actually suffered from adverse conditions. Adverse conditions, if society if societal factors allowed to respond to adverse climate change, then that would occur. So I would say, in the long term, they profited more from climate change than they actually suffered from climate change. Now, beneficial climate change allowed expansion of arable. We've seen examples of that before. If you have more precipitation, you can start farming in regions that may have been too dry before. It lowers the capital investment that you need. It's usually not the difference between able or not able to farm there, but it lowers the investment that you have to do in these regions. But we also have to take into account that expansion of arable is never only determined by climate change. It's determined by a lot of factors. Population growth might be a factor, or the emergence or not emergence of internal and outside markets. Changes in consumption might be a factor there. And also, very important, the demand for raw materials. It's not only food that is produced. So in the ancient world, we see, in the long run, an expansion of arable from the early first millennium BC up to, well, then it depends where you actually are in the Roman world, but in the West, maybe about 200, 3rd century, in the East, many parts somewhat later. So intensification and expansion of arable farming, and these are two sides to increasing demand, but intensification is necessary simply for logistical reasons, because if there's an increased demand, it's not always useful to expand arable farming in another location due to logistical constraints. So in some places you need intensification, in other places expansion of arable farming would be enough. Now, so my main point is that there are multiple factors driving expansion, intensification in the form of terracing, in the form of manuring, in the form of drainage, irrigation, and all these factors. Finally, an example, a case study. I have a few recent studies from Western Anatolia. First, Maranzana 2021 in the same volume that Soplaki was in, that I mentioned earlier. And there's the study of the Western Anatolian Plateau. Now, my summary is very short, very brief, but they say, if you look at it, 4th to mid-7th century, that's actually the period of the highest population density, urbanization, exploitation of the countryside. We see increase in cereal, wine, olive cultivation, expansion of grazing in this period, occupation of local marginal lands, evidence of manuring, drainage. But over this period, this long period from the 4th to the mid-7th century, the paleoclimate proxies indicate that there are several shifts, several trends from drier, wetter, drier, wetter. You do not see any impact of those. You can say, but our resolution is not really good enough to show that. But on the other hand, that also means that the impact of it was not significant enough for us to see that in the evidence that there is. Sagalassos, Dams and co-authors, they show actually the same thing. A late Roman peak in exploitation of the countryside, the very cold decades of the 530s, 540s, it's not visible. So at the multi-decadal level, we do not see any, do not see the impact of climate change. Then there's a sudden end to this in the mid-7th century, both in Western Anatolian Plateau and in Sagalassos. But the paleoclimate proxies do not indicate any significant climate change around that time. Climates did not change then. So what explains this sudden end to the intensive exploitation of this region? I would argue, I would believe the authors then who say it's the Arab-Byzantine wars that made the countryside a lot more insecure, and so that meant that people did not dare to exploit the countryside in the same way. Again, I would conclude there's no Malthusian pressure. You do not see any Malthusian pressure. I would say you see a Bossaroopian response. The ceiling can be raised if there's sufficient demand. No climate-driven decline. Now, another example, but drainage and irrigation, I've seen mentioned drainage and irrigation before. Drainage and irrigation can be a good response to climate change at a multi-decadal level. If you have increase of precipitation and waterlogging is a problem for you.
You brought the beauty, Jim.
I'm sorry?
You finished with Irish?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. It's all about that.
So if you have waterlogging as a problem, well, drainage would be a good answer. If drought is a problem, then irrigation would be a good solution. But again, drainage and irrigation are not only responses to climate change, but it can also be responses to the need to intensify your production due to population growth, increase of markets, or whatever. So again, I would say that societal factors are more important than climate. And I steal again the data from somebody else. That's a study by Isdebsi of the Negev and co-authors of the Negev Desert. And they show expansion of settlement, expansion of exploitation of the land. And this is in a region where certainly nowadays rain-fed agriculture would be impossible. So, but irrigation is necessary there. But they say, they point out that the expansion of settlement there actually started before the paleoclimate proxies indicate a more humid phase. So it predates the more humid phase. And then after climate changes and you get a drier phase. But the end of the expansion of the settlement, the end of this more intensive use of that countryside, is actually after the onset of the drier period. So there's no coincidence, chronological coincidence between the trend breaks in climate and the changes that you find in the landscape, in the human landscape. So one of the things that I would want to point out is that once the physical channels are there, if you talk about drainage and irrigation, but also once the legal institutional structures are there, that gives you the tools to be resilient, to bring in the word resilient after half an hour. So, and again, it's societal factors that are very important. Now, so I've now pointed out a few examples where I would say these societies were, just like most early modern societies, not very vulnerable to the kind of climate change that we see in antiquity. But then, what happened in the Roman West? And I try to be as short as I can. In the 3rd century, in various places in the West, not all at the same time, of course, but roughly in this period, while the East, many parts of the East, still on the way to the peak period of the later Roman Empire, we see contraction in many parts of the West. To what extent is that climate change? Now, unfortunately, our evidence for climate change in Gaul, the Germanic provinces, Britain, is not as good as we have for the East or some parts of the Mediterranean. So our trade evidence doesn't go back that far, and speleothems, I don't think that there are many speleothem data for this part of the Roman world. But then, if climate change would be the main cause of the contraction, then that would be an exceptional situation for, I would argue, for a fairly complex pre-industrial society. So we cannot deny that there may have been at a multi-decadal level periods that had adverse conditions and that increased the chance of harvest failures. But my conclusion would be it's not actually the increased frequency of harvest failures that's the main difference. The main difference in this period is that societal factors had changed, and this part of the Roman world was less and less able to respond to the increased frequency of harvests, and that's not only I've been talking mainly about agricultural production, but there's an important other half, of course, of response to that, and that's the societal factors involved in distributing or storing grain. I haven't been talking about that, but so I would argue that changes in society in the West made that this part of society was less able to respond to increased frequencies of harvest failure. Now, concluding remarks. Harper had this sentence in his introduction. The hard question has become not whether, but how to insert the influences of the natural environment into the sequence of cause and effect. Now, his entire book gives, shows what his answer to that is. Fairly Malthusian, not talking about the pandemics, but my response would be different. Not from a Malthusian carrying capacity, if we should approach that question, but from a Bosseropian approach. That also means that we do not have to see, we should not see this as environmental factors such as climate setting in motion societal processes, but that these are part of transformations that always are going on. And that was my main point that I tried to bring in it's societal factors that determine to what extent climate change can find an adequate response, that there is an adequate response in societies. Many parts in the East, I would argue, you see little impact of climate change because the conditions were there to overcome that. In the West, not difficult to say what role climate does play, but I think that we can say that this was a weaker society in the face of adverse climate change. Thank you.